I'm extremely pleased to be here at BAU for the Future AI Summit. Yesterday, I listened with quite a sense of inspiration when the founder of BAU spoke about the need for a new paradigm in education. When he talked about a change in education from the mass production of standardized parts, I didn't use that phrase, but that was the idea, I think, to really developing the individual potential of each student, of each person. For the need for multidisciplinarity, because in this complex world and the challenges we face today, there's no specialized discipline, the study of which can fully prepare us to meet the challenges of the rapidly changing world we live in. We need a wider perspective. We need, as he said, a new paradigm in education. And I think the words he spoke are so relevant and important to understanding the significance of AI and the moment that we live in, and the essential potential that AI has for unleashing human creativity. That was the word he used. Not for replacing the human being by its creativity, but by enabling us to be more creative. And I'd like to share with you my thoughts this morning about why I believe that's true. I'd like to start with just a brief introduction about the work that we're doing in the World Academy of Art and Science. Very brief, just so you understand where we're coming from and why I'm saying the things I do. The Academy was founded by eminent intellectuals like Albert Einstein, Bertrand Russell, and some of you know this name, Robert Oppenheimer, who's become a famous movie star in the last few years, remembered because he was the father of the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb. And what happened with the Manhattan Project has everything to do with the founding of the Academy, because he and other eminent scientists who thought they were working to save the world found up 10 years later, when the nuclear arms race really and the Cold War gained momentum, that actually they had created a great threat to the future of humanity. And the Academy was founded in 1960 by scientists from many different countries who were deeply concerned about the social consequences of science, which they thought was a hero's work to find new knowledge and discover the laws of nature and share them with humanity, and realized that it was also a double-edged sword. It was a Pandora's box, potentially, because you weren't sure what you were releasing, or rather what would be done with what you released. And so this academy was not founded to do fundamental research like hundreds of other important institutions in the world, but to study global social challenges, problems, and opportunities, and understand the role of science and art in addressing those. That is the role of knowledge. And that's what I'd like to speak to you about today. Interestingly enough, in 2013, we were invited by the United Nations office in Geneva to conduct with them a study on global challenges and opportunities in the 21st century. And we came to some important conclusions about the times we live in. And I'm only going to mention, well, two of them now. One of them was that if we are serious about addressing the global challenges and opportunities we face now, we need a new paradigm in education. It was exactly what I heard from your founder of BAU yesterday morning. We need to do something differently, because education is such an important part of our lives. It's such an important part of capturing the knowledge from the past and preparing the youth for the future. In a time that's changing so quickly, we're not sure what that future will be. And we don't have decades to figure it out. We have to be learning as we go. then education is going to have to change. And another conclusion we came to is one of a famous founder of the Academy, Einstein, who said, we cannot solve problems by thinking in the same way that we've created the problems. It's a very famous quote, and that has very much to do with what we're going to talk today, because I'd like to talk about the way we're thinking and the role of AI in either helping us think better and differently, or compounding the difficulties in it. The real issue about the challenges has to do with the way we think. And that became very evident when, right after our work with the UN, generative AI came to the surface, raised emerging opportunities, amazing opportunities, fantastic technological wonders, and at the same time, frightened many people around the world, including the scientists who had invented it, as what's going to happen with this technology. So this is the kind of issue that we're trying to grapple with. And we started in 2003, January, at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, which is the largest technology event in the world. 120,000 scientists, business, and technology leaders gathering together to talk about the future. And they invited us to talk about not technology, not AI, but to talk about human security. We were running a campaign with the UN on human security for everybody. And they felt that there's no more important message for the founders and leaders of these businesses and the technology geniuses who are doing so much than to think about the impact of technology and business on the future security of mankind. And that's what we started just a year and a half ago. This is the quote by Einstein, which I already mentioned. Most of you, I hope, have seen it many times. It's a profound truth. AI is, and this is what we spoke at the CES show, the technology is really a double-edged sword. It can create all the wonders that have transformed the world in the last 2 centuries, and it can take away all that it's created and give us a condition that's very difficult for us to grapple with and a high level of anxiety about the future. The two go together. But also, and that's my theme for today, AI has the potential to help us develop, to help us become better people. And what we learned from grappling with and using this technology can help all of us learn things that we haven't known before. And not so much a question of replacing us, helping us become more human than we are up until now. And that's what I'd like to talk about today. To appreciate the potentials that I think are there in AI, it's important that we also understand the limitations in the present way we're functioning, the present way we're thinking and using our mental faculties. So I'd like to start with that, not talking about AI, but talking about us. AI is making us, the process of trying to govern AI, you heard it in many of the sessions yesterday, the problem of governing it makes us more conscious of the inherent biases that can come into the AI system unintentionally when we want it to give us the facts, but it picks up all the inherent biases that are there in human nature. The prejudices coming from culture, relating race, religion, age, gender, and all such associated things, but many others as well. There's the bias of the fact that something hasn't happened up until now, and one of our tendencies to think, well, if it hasn't happened until now, it probably won't happen. That's what we call a temporal bias. Something like this has never happened to me, or I've never seen it before, so it's an experiential bias. We have many different biases that influence the way we think and live. And we're seeing those in AI as well. We're seeing when we want to govern this and we want to remove bias, We're trying to remove biases from instruments that we human beings have created, where our own thinking is filled with bias. The whole science revolution was trying to remove bias from that was the whole point of the Enlightenment and all, to remove biases, prejudices, superstitions, and all, and make us really rational human beings. But it's not so easy, as we have found out. AI can not only help us become aware of the limits in the way we think, but it can help us become aware of some of the untapped potentials of how we can think in future and how to develop them. I put it, it can help us develop higher levels of mentality. It can help us be more conscious. So I'd like to start by talking about the way thinking has developed and evolved over the last, let's say, 500 years, since the beginning of the Enlightenment. The great scientific discoveries that came through the development of the way we think. And one of the first breakthroughs I would call is analytic thinking. And by analytic thinking, I mean the mind's capacity to look at things, divide them into different parts, subdivide them, and try to find out what's the commonality or characteristic of each of those parts so we can categorize them, classify them, and organize them. And humanity has done that in remarkable ways in the last 4 or 5 centuries. Here's just a few of the very basic ways in which analytic thinking has helped us understand the atom, minerals, molecules, life forms, species, and virtually we've classified everything, including the stars and the quasars and the micro subatomic particles and everything, all the way up to giving us the first fundamental basis for artificial intelligence. Not only has it led to great discoveries, but there's an inbuilt bias in analytic thinking, which we're all taught from an early age. It's the fundamental in our educational system, which we're going to encounter when we deal with AI as well. One of the things AI does is it tries to reduce complex structures to their common least denominators. And I gave you a very extreme example to say that if you wanted a really analytic approach to the human body, you might summarize it, well, it's something that's 57% water. And that's fairly accurate. And we can say how much hydrogen it has and how much carbon it has and how much oxygen and so forth and so on. But how much in getting that knowledge, how much of the reality of the human body have we left out? How much do we really understand of the human body by getting its molecular content or atomic content? We have a tiny little piece. And this is an important lesson for us in trying to understand the role of AI in our life. Another thing it does is it divides reality into many different pockets so we can concentrate on them. If I want to be a physician, well, I want to be specifically a pediatrician or a urologist or a neuroscientist or whatever it may be. I specialize. And you know, today, this is not today, about 10 years ago, there were 1,000 disciplines and subdisciplines in the United States taught in universities around the country. I haven't even tried to update it since then, because I'm sure there are many more. We may have 20 or 50 just in AI alone now, as it's diversified. And what does that mean? We're becoming more and more knowledgeable about smaller and smaller parts of reality. And there's so much to learn about each of those parts that it's very difficult for us to focus on the bigger picture. So I use the famous quote, he can't see the forest from the trees. We see a tree and it looks so, we see so much in it, we become an expert in it, but we lose sight of the forest. I had an experience about 10 years ago, a quick story. I met a famous economist from Yale University And he said, well, I asked him what's his discipline. He says he's a labor economist. I said, that's really wonderful, because we've been doing a lot of work on employment strategies and everything, and we could talk about it. He said, oh, that's not my subject. Sorry, I thought you said you were a labor economist. He's specializing in labor unions, not how to create jobs for them. So it's indicative of a problem that the more localized, focused knowledge we get, the more at the same time we tend to lose contact with the bigger picture of which all our knowledge is a part. And that has real significance. And when the founder said, when Enver said yesterday that it's got to be multidisciplinary, I think that's what he had in mind. We cannot afford to be just specialists anymore. We've got to understand the bigger world in which it works. I had a conference with the IEEE, the big international organization on electrical and electronic engineering, a specialized group focusing on AI and cognitive computing. And I asked them, when you're teaching students, how much are you teaching your AI specialists about the world in which they live, about the possible social consequences and policy implications, kind of like how much are the physicists teaching about the possibility of developing a new nuclear weapon or something like that. How much do we understand, the people who are inventing, how much do they understand the society we live in? And what are the implications of it? Well, that was 8 years ago, and they said nothing. That's not part of the engineering education. I hope the answer would be different today when we're becoming so conscious of the wider implications. This analytic thinking also does something else. We tend to get beautiful models of how reality works. I mentioned the economy there. I was speaking to a world-famous econometrician recently, and about the new formulas and models that they're developing in financial markets and everything. And I said, well, tell me, what's your experience about how far these models are really describe reality? He says, oh, no, they're not intended to describe reality. They only are taking a few key variables that help us understand the big picture of how things are connected with each other. So the problem for us is when we learn things, we think we're learning how they really are. I studied economics 55 years ago, the law of supply and demand and free markets and everything, only to learn that it's very hard to find an example of free markets or where the law of supply and demand really works. But we learn that, and we do our studies around it. So we tend to mistake ideas about reality for the reality itself. And when we do that, we can get into big trouble. The other thing, so what we have done, and what science has done, and particularly in the 20th century, is our way of thinking has evolved. And you all know this because you're all studying things like this. We've tried to get out of the limits of analysis, even though it's a very powerful tool, mental tool, by also understanding things are connected and interconnected with each other. And it's not enough we know the thing or the part. We have to know how all the parts are linked together and try to understand their interdependencies and connectivities. So you might say a good proverb for that is, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Instead of trying to describe each part and element, if we can see them in relationship to each other. I studied medicine for a while, in which I learned about all of the 11 systems that are there in the human body through physiology and anatomy. And you know that when we learn it in a textbook, we study the metabolic system and then the digestive system and the hormones and the nervous system and so forth and so on. But when you actually, and I'm not a physician, so when you actually go in and look at the human body, you find that every one of these things is connected to all the others. And it's an abstraction. You cannot take the circulatory system or the respiratory system as separately from another. I had a heart surgery about 3 years ago, and when I recovered, when I was coming out of surgery, I told the surgeon, he says, you know, I've been having an ache in my tooth for the last 2 years, and it's gone. And he shook his head. Yeah, of course. Our idea of these systems is helpful for us to conceptualize, but that's not how they work in the human body. The interdependence is everywhere. And of course, what we're learning today is, especially with relation to the environment, that it's connected to everything. It's connected to the bees who are pollinating the flowers and the plants. It's connected to the algae in the oceans and the coral reefs. The climate is an interconnection of the whole biosphere on Earth. And we have to discover more and more about those interconnections, so we have to think more and more not only of systems, but of a complexity that's so great. It's mind-boggling, but the reality is like that. But the achievements of systems thinking have been astonishing. We wouldn't be here today talking about AI if it wasn't for the breakthroughs in so many fields, the impact on healthcare and drug production and so many things. All of it, the environment, at least we know more than we ever did before about it. And this just shows how technology is as an example of that. And we heard about it yesterday and saw some heard some dramatic ideas about it. The result of these, what I'm calling transdisciplinary systems, they don't really belong to just one or two disciplines. They connect the disciplines together. These are a few examples of that. Information theory, AI, of course, earth sciences, robotics, and so forth. So how do we learn how to think in terms of systems and complexity? That's been a real challenge for us. And where does AI come into that? But systems thinking, however valuable it is, it's not quite enough to help us solve all the problems we face in humanity, because it's left out some important things. And it's given us an idea that we can describe and understand reality in a kind of a mechanical way, the way we understand the revolution of the planets in the universe, or the flow of blood circulating in the body, or the carbon cycles that are warming up the climate and all. That all makes a lot of sense to the mind, but it leaves out some important things, especially when we apply it to ourselves. Are we a system? Are we as human beings simply a complex system? Medical science has discovered decades and decades ago that the attitude, expectations, personality of the patient has in many cases as much to do with the results of the treatment as the medicine does, or even the surgery does. That you can't deal just with the human body, avoiding the mind, avoiding the fears or anxieties or faith or whatever it may be, that the psychological or subjective dimension of our personality is a tremendous indicator of the success of medical treatment. And if you've heard of the placebo effect, you know that in a large percentage of cases, not in all, the attitude is enough to replace the physical treatment. And that if people really believe that the treatment will work. Well, the same thing happens to be true in economics. In 2008, in a period of a few months, $8 trillion disappeared from the global economy. Actually, most of it from the US economy, and then it started disappearing elsewhere. $8 trillion. What happened? There were no earthquakes. There were no wars. Something changed. The thing that changed is people lost trust in the future of the economic system. a change in the attitude of the public about what's going to happen in the future could make $8 trillion disappear virtually overnight. So everything has not only an objective dimension which we can measure quantitatively and try to model in systems and all, but there's a whole subjective reality that tends to be left out of the picture when we try to think entirely in the mechanics of a systems thinking. And most important of all, and I was particularly pleased when we heard Enros speak yesterday, he said, the really most important thing is developing the creative individuality of each student in education. Well, where does individuality where does it fall in our sciences, even in our psychology? We study types. We study common attributes and common characteristics and what people are typically like by culture, by age, by generation, and so forth. But what about the individual? What about the fact that if you look at the astonishing achievements, whether it's of the last decade or the last century or there's always at the bottom or at the center of it some unique individual who thinks differently, whether it's a Leonardo da Vinci or a Copernicus or a Steve Jobs or whoever, or a Ataturk or a Nelson Mandela or a Gandhi or a Gorbachev. At the root of things, there's something that we can't classify by a system or even by a type. There's the catalyst of the individual, and that's in each of us. How much does our way of thinking understand not only what the percentages are, the norms are, the statistics tell us, but what about the individual and the role of the individual? It doesn't lend itself. We don't lend ourselves to quantitative analysis. So, what do we do about it? This is a famous quote by Francis Scott Fitzgerald, the American author. I like it very much because he touches a profound point. The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposite ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. Because the reality of the world we live in is one where opposites are constantly presenting themselves to us for reconciliation. And isn't that what Einstein did with matter and energy? And Newton did it with motion and inertia. And it was done with electromagnetism because we thought they were two completely different phenomena until we realized that it's one phenomenon expressing in two different ways. And these are scientific facts. Today, we've got countries that advocate extreme reliance on individuality. That's where I come from. And at the other end, extreme reliance on getting things right for the social collective, and the individual can adjust for what's good for the... And yet, we don't see how to reconcile the truths, the legitimate truth of the individual and the legitimate truth of the social collective, and how do we reconcile them to get a society that not only works for a few creative people, but works for everybody? How much do we understand by that? By the way we think, by what we've taught. This is a quote from Leonardo. Realize that everything comes to everything. Everything connects to everything else. This doesn't fit in with traditional systems theory or with analytic thinking. We need another word for it and another concept. And we call it analytic or integrated. We call it integrated thinking. Looking at the relationship with everything. Now, these concepts here, I hope you'll all agree, these are pretty important things for us in our life. Health is important, peace is important, harmony is really hard to come by, but it's important. Truth is certainly important in science, and yet none of these concepts can be properly modeled, named, understood, defined, or modeled, either by analysis or by systems, because they belong to the whole. They belong to the whole individual, to the whole society, to the whole world in which we live. They're connected to everything else. And yet that's not the way we're taught to think. And I'm coming shortly to what all this has to do with. Einstein said that the intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. And what he meant by that is the greatest scientific discoveries, Einstein and many others, Karl Popper, the famous science philosopher, and many others have said their great discoveries didn't come from rational thinking at all. It came from intuition. But he said, we've created a society that honors the servant. That's the rational mind that explains after the fact and has forgotten the gift. So if great scientific discoveries or other types of discoveries have really come as a result of intuition, shouldn't we be learning about it? Shouldn't we be trying to figure out and understand how intuition is born and how it develops and how we can grow and know more of it? But that's not normally part of the science curriculum. No, that doesn't belong here, is the typical response. Intuition is that thing that reconciles opposites and contradictions and shows us connections, like matter and energy are really two forms of the same thing that we never dreamed before. It's a different type of thinking. What does this have to do with AI? It often emerges when our mental activity is silent. And Einstein and others have testified to the fact that the greatest insights came to them when they weren't even thinking about the problem, when the mind was distracted on something else or off in recreation, because it uses a different faculty that we yet haven't learned how to educate ourselves to use. So I'm coming to the conclusion now. I think the issue about AI is not whether the machine is going to take over the world and put us all to whatever they want to do. I think the issue is we are the creators of the AI, just as we have been of all the technologies and all the instruments and tools that humanity has used since we invented the spear or the knife or the fire, discovered how to make fire, or the wheel, or any of those things. They have been used to help us grow and develop. So we don't have to do what we were doing before. We don't have to plow the field ourselves by hand. We can use bullock carts to do it, or a tractor to do it, or the latest technology to do it. Now, it helps us develop by we no longer have to do the thing we were doing in the past. And a lot of the things AI is going to do is remove the drudgery, not the physical drudgery of working in the field. Well, you know, some of the drudgery of spending days or weeks in the library or on the internet struggling to find something which AI, ChatGPT or another can find in 4 seconds, or do the spell checking and the proofing, which we all love to do, I'm sure, in 1 minute that we spend weeks or months or days doing on a book, depending on what it is. This is not removing our future destiny. This is liberating us from the drudgery of that, of the calculations and the memorizing everything that our education has been, by helping us develop higher capacities. Help us focus on learning more and developing higher capacities for the future. Machines have always served us, but it depends on us whether we let the machine become the object of everything, or we use it so we can keep growing and developing. And so what I think of the future is a future, it's not a question of whether the machine does it or not. It's a question of what's the relationship between us and the technology we've developed. It's a symbiotic relationship. We use the calculator, we use the mobile phone. We don't feel we're being dominated by it, sometimes we get lost in the mobile. It's a tool so that we can become more productive or more fulfilled in our life. And I think that's the most constructive way to think of AI is not, I'm not minimizing the challenges or the possible misuse of the technology. Everything has that. But I think it's important that we try to think, how can the use of this technology free my energy and capacities so I can develop further? I can develop higher mental capacities than I have done up until now. So in conclusion, I just wanted to say, the development of AI is a process by which human beings are gradually we're discovering more and more, not only of what the machine can do, but this is the opportunity to discover more and more about what we can do. And I think that's what the future of education has to focus on. How AI is not going to master us, but how it's going to free up our energies to think wider, to see interconnectivities that we didn't think of before, because AI isn't ground by the same silos that we are. It teaches us to think more widely and see wider connections. So I hope this has been useful. I think that I'm excited that BAU has taken this conference and given so much importance to this. This really is an important issue. And if BAU is to be a university that really becomes a pioneer in the new type of education, that we need to take fullest advantage of this technology, then certainly this is a momentous occasion. It's not only for the students here or for Turkey, it's for the world, because that's what we need in the future. Thank you.